and I'm getting it autographed by people who contributed.
Oh, excellent.
So, yeah. And we're selling those for charity. Here it is. The Pan Am recipe nostalgia. They make wonderful gifts. Everybody that's bought one has come back and bought one. Yes, to send to your house.
I have to move out.
Send me an email,
If I get
and I'll ship it from my house.
Good morning, Jon Krupnick from Fort Lauderdale in Boulder, Colorado. We have 11 grandkids, 6 of them in Boulder, and that's the reason I'm here. We were visiting them, and it's an only 7-hour direct flight from Denver to Honolulu, and that was just too tempting not to include this on the program. But my son-in-law, who gives me a pretty rough time, he said, "Oh God," he said, "I feel sorry for the man that's going to have to sit next to you for 7 hours when you're loaded to give a talk." And I said, "Oh, I won't tell him anything about Pan Am." Well, if any of you know Dr. Randall Sakamoto, anybody know him? Randall Sakamoto, he's an ophthalmologist here in town. He is now an expert on the Pan Am flying boat. He bought 2 books and 4 posters for his office. Otherwise, I couldn't have afforded to make the trip. But and I have one other confession to make. You'll find out during my talk that my fascination with Pan Am didn't come through aviation, it came through my love of the little Pacific Islands. And back in 1992, my wife and I took 4 months off and went to just about every Pacific Island that had a landing strip. And I said one day, I'm going to get a tattoo. Well, of course, my wife isn't delighted about that because all the grandkids will say, "But Papa has one," you know. So I've worn this fishhook ever since I went to the South Pacific in '92. And I had a couple of days in Maui about a month ago, and you get to a certain age and you say, "The heck with it, you know, it's my turn. I'm just gonna do it." So we have a lot of oceans and years to cross, so we better get started. And before we move on from this image, I have to share how special it is. It's a fantasy piece. It never existed. Never were these 3 planes together, to my knowledge, at one time. But they are the Pan Am Clippers that united the Pacific Rim. And I commissioned this painting by a marvelous muralist who lived in Fort Lauderdale, who did aviation art that was given to George Bush. And in this wonderful picture with the Oakland Bay Bridge in the background, we have the Sikorsky S-42 circling overhead. This is the Martin 130, and this is the famous China Clipper. And it's taxiing in from the left. And then the mighty B-314 taking off. And it's just a stunning image. The original is in my office. And I had that done, and that led to doing some posters and eventually to a book and the whole thing. So this story is really told in these 3 planes and how they made it across the ocean. This kind of fits into what Don was saying. This is an image that Pan Am commissioned to tie the Clipper airplane to the Clipper sailing ships of the past. And it's a classic, an iconic image that you'll find in all kinds of forms in Pan Am advertising and in memorabilia. But who has inspired 8 reunions or organized them other than Don Cooper? These reunions have been, as you folks well know, in Berlin, Victoria, British Columbia, in Idaho and Coeur d'Alene, now in Honolulu. And Don claims that this is going to be his last roundup, his last reunion. And I had the pleasure once of flying on a commercial plane that was making its last flight. And as you probably know, when the pilot comes in on his last flight, as he approaches the terminal, the fire trucks are on both sides and spraying that plane with honor for the captain. So I'd like you all to stand up, give Don a big round of applause. And where are you, Don? Don, where are you? Come on up here a minute. Come on up just a minute. Come on, where are you? I lied to you. I said I'd only do an hour and a half. It's going to be 2 hours. Come on. All right.
Thanks, John.
With appreciation and gratitude.
Thank you.
Before you leave, though, Darlene Laster has been my guardian angel, gotten everything set up for me. When I was here a month ago, she picked us up, took me everywhere. Darlene, where are you? Come on up. Come on. We're not going to... I told her I wanted to wear a lei. She had it for me this morning. So if you would come up, we got one for you too.
I've been protecting it. Thank you.
All right, so how many sleepless nights? Well, how many sleepless nights?
The last 2 weeks.
Yeah, and fought through sickness and all. Thank you so much. That's great. Now, other people have certainly helped, and if I mispronounce it, please forgive me, but as I call your names, just stand up. Tom Carroll, is he here? Jan, Tracy, are you here? Max Gurney, I've spoken to you a couple of times here. Ada Hadelson Dunn, Terry and Jim Kelsko, Gene Coeffy, Kevin and Cinda Belzer Kramer, Darlene, thank you, Marilyn Murphy, Betty Smith, Miff Salvatino, and many, many others. So these are the people that worked so hard to make this happen, and I'm proud that they allowed me to be part of it and to enjoy it with you. Now, before we start our flight, and before you put on your seatbelts, I'd like you to hear from a couple of satisfied prior travelers. And my favorite among them is Jimmy Buffett. And I tried every trick in the world to meet Jimmy Buffett, but if there's anything that a singer dislikes more than a doctor, it's a trial lawyer. And I had a hard time meeting him. And then one Friday in December, he called my house and said, "Is John there?" My wife accidentally cut off the phone. I said, "Who was it?" She said, "Well, someone called. Maybe they'll call back." She knew I'd die if I knew it was Jimmy Buffett. And he called and he said, "Hey, John, this is Jimmy Buffett." And I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "No, you're not. I know your voice." He says, "No," he says, "I'd like you to help me decorate my flying boat, the Albatross." I said, "Just so happens I'm free, Jimmy." What day is it? So I met Jimmy, and he ended up buying a bunch of stuff from me. And he owed me like $1,500, and I said, "Jimmy," he said, "I don't have it." I said, "We'll cut it up over a couple of months, it won't hurt a bit." He laughed. He said, "I'll send you a check when I get back to the office." And that's my son on the left, the emergency room doctor. I took him along to make sure I wouldn't be too uncool. He says, "Calm down, Dad, calm down." And Jimmy Buffett agreed to do the foreword for my first book was 300 pages. And I was getting more stories in, so I was going to have a little addendum. But once Jimmy Buffett agreed to do the foreword, I put it on steroids, and it's up here at 700 pages. And here's another great image. He wrote on the cover of the limited edition, "John, let's build one," which would have been fun. But here's what Jimmy said. In the foreword to the book, he says, "It's truly refreshing to be taken back in time by the pages of a book. Jon Krupnick's book gives us a wonderful glimpse into one of the great time periods in all of aviation." Then in Buffett's book, A Pirate Looks at 50, he makes this statement, which I think is really understands the significance of the flying boat. And this is what he said in the body of that book, A Pirate Looks at 50. "Flying boats are like no other machines. They were created out of the same desire to explore that drove the early pathfinders from Columbus to Captain Cook. The designers and engineers who brought these flying boats to life built more than airplanes. They created art. But their time was short. Runways built for World War II were the concrete stakes that pierced the heart of the giant flying boats." 11 years, that's all it was from start to finish of the flying boat era. And here we are today, 60, 70, 75 years later, still honoring those achievements of almost a century ago. And it's because they were romantic, they were exciting, and they were so revolutionary that they can't be forgotten. Well, I was coming home from North Carolina. I was listening to the biography of Warren Buffett, another person I admire greatly. And I found out he was a stamp collector, and I have been fortunate to own a share or two of Berkshire Hathaway along the way, against the advice of my brokers. But what does he know? It's the only stock I have that actually went up in value. And so I sent a copy of my book to Warren Buffett. And you kind of hope you're going to get a letter back. You know, what are you doing it for? You sent him a book. And I said, "I'm sending you this because you've looked after my money carefully. I was a stamp collector in my youth, as were you. And one of your distant cousins was nice enough to write the foreword for my book." Well, I didn't know if he was a cousin. I didn't know. But as a trial lawyer, you never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So I threw that in, you know. Now here's why I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I was born on St. Patrick's Day. If you know anything about the Chinese horoscope, I'm a dragon, a steel dragon. That's the luckiest. So between St. Patrick's Day and the steel dragon, I've had good luck. This letter was sent to Buffett, Warren Buffett, and I got this reply that the timing was everything. Here's what he said. "What a terrific gift!" Explanation point. I got the letter memorized. "Just started looking at it, noted your good-looking family, and I know it's going to give me hours and hours of enjoyment." Paragraph. "Yes, I did collect stamps in my youth when I was much poorer than I am today. Nothing much of note, but I do have one cover." See, that's collector's talk, so he knew the talk. He said, "I do have one cover with all 3 Zeppelins on it." And then to show me that he knew what he was talking about, he says the 65, the 130, and the 265. And then he put in parentheses, "No, I don't have an inverted Jenny, the upside-down upside-down airplane that's worth about $500,000 a stamp." Now here's where I'm the luckiest guy in the world. Tomorrow, by chance, Jimmy Buffett and his daughter are coming by for lunch, and we'll have a lot of fun talking about your book together. Now, what is Warren Buffett and Jimmy Buffett talking about but a trial lawyer in Fort Lauderdale that neither one of them would give the time of day to, except we connect through Pan Am. So that was my bridge. This is something you cannot get on eBay. And I've got pictured in my office of our dog's name was Buffett too, and I got him arranged. I got him arranged by good looks. The dog, Buffett, Jimmy Buffett, Warren Buffett. Then I got him arranged by intelligence, Warren Buffett, Jimmy Buffett, and my dog. And I admire him greatly, and I admire Jimmy Buffett greatly, and to think that for 10 minutes, when they met in Omaha, they were talking about a trial lawyer in Fort Lauderdale. So that's what this collection has given to me. Well, everyone always says, "You're not a pilot." I'm not. My son, the emergency room doctor, said, "Dad, you have an hysterical response to critical situations. Do not become an emergency room doctor. Do not become a pilot. Stick to trial law. You're not going to hurt anybody when you get hysterical in response to something going on." So I've stayed away from emergency medicine and from flying because when things start to go wrong, I say, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" You can't do that when you're a pilot or emergency room doctor. So I got into the history of Pan Am through my love of small Pacific islands. When I was 12, 13, 14, growing up in Cleveland, the football season, if you people can't remember it, ended before Christmas. They'd have the championship game about December 23rd, and that was it. And if you lived in Cleveland, you'd put up the storm windows. There was nothing to do till baseball came in April. I mean, there wasn't any basketball anyone cared about. And so I'd send these postcards off to these remote islands. I'd find them in the World Almanac, Palmyra, Johnston, Canton, Wake Island, and I get these postcards back. Well, then you get to be about 16, you find out about girls, you find out school's a little harder, and this shoebox I had of all these little postcards I'd sent out for years and years was, in the attic at home, back in Cleveland. So by this time, I've graduated college, I've gone to law school, we got 2 kids, put them to bed, don't have any money, what do? You didn't call your mother to ask her if she had them. You sent her a letter, said, "Do you still have that shoebox full of these postcards?" And she did, and she sent it to me in Florida, so I started to do the same thing, send out letters to these islands to see what new postmarks there were. And then I started to make a little money. And there was an auction, and they had this item for sale that was from Kingman Reef. And I knew that Kingman Reef was the most remote U.S. possession in the world, claimed by a family that lived here in Honolulu as their own property. So I bid the unheard of amount of $150 at a time when I was probably maybe making $200 a week. It was a huge amount, and I bought this envelope, not because it had anything to do with Pan Am, not because it was a flight cover or anything else, but just because it filled in that unknown U.S. possession that I never thought I'd get any mail from, which was Kingman Reef. And then in the early 70s, a guy here in Honolulu was writing a book, I can hardly even say the word now, the Aerophilatelic History of Hawaii from 1910 to 1970 or something. And he wrote me a letter and he said, "I hear you have a lot of envelopes from this area. Do you have any flight covers that were flown on Pan Am?" And I said, "I don't know." I go through and I didn't even Xerox it. I just drew a picture of this and sent it to him. And he gets all excited. He said, "This is the one item that we knew should exist, but nobody had ever found one. It's an envelope on the first survey flight to New Zealand in March of 1937. And I said, "Well, if I have the most difficult, if I have the rarest, why don't I build a collection around it? Use that as the anchor." So I went from collecting little worthless pieces of paper from these islands to something that was highly collectible before people started to really look at these flight covers, these special envelopes that flew on the first flights for Pan Am. And the more that I learned about the Pan Am history, the more hooked I got on it. And I do have a little bit of an obsessive compulsive personality. And once I get interested in something, I try to get everything there is about it, learn about it, organize it, do all those things. And I was fortunate because I lived in South Florida and a lot of the Pan Am people had retired there. So in my study, I learned, as all of you have already known, that there was this brash guy, graduated Yale, he was in the flying club during World War I. His father was a Wall Street banker. People think that he had Latin blood in him because of Juan. There wasn't any Latin. They might have had a Cuban chauffeur. It was about the only thing the Trips had that wasn't blue blood. And I think that might be where the name came from. So Jon Tripp goes to his dad's wealthy friends, the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts and everything, and he raises $300,000. And he founds an aviation corporation. It wasn't Pan Am, it was the Aviation Corporation of the Americas. And they were flying some stuff around up in New England. And in 1927, the post office announced that they were going to start foreign airmail service to collectors. That's FAM. FAM-1 was the route, you ready for this? From Key West to Havana. You could almost do it with a slingshot. It's 90 miles. So Jon Tripp says, you know, maybe there's some money in this carrying the airmail. He said, let's bid on the contract. But he wouldn't risk bidding the Aviation Corporation of America. He says, let's use that subsidiary that we've never used, that's worthless, so if we lose it, we haven't lost anything. They bid the contract with Pan Am. And they were awarded the contract. Nobody else was dumb enough to bid. Under the contract, they had to start airmail service by the end of October of 1927 or lose the commission. And it would go out for bid again. So here comes this guy, Jon Tripp, and a sweetheart of a guy. He only had two main goals. One was world domination, and the other was destroy competition. That's all he wanted. So here's Jon Tripp. He was, imagine, he was 28 years old in 1927. He has just bid on this contract, got to fly the plane by the end of October, and he didn't have an airplane. So he sends Ed Music down. He was a stunt pilot that would, you know, fly at the fairs and everything. And this guy Caldwell. And down in Key West, a guy was ferrying a plane to Central America or South America, probably before they had drugs. Or maybe because of drugs, I don't know. But he begs and borrows to borrow this plane, this float plane, for a flight before the end of October so they can complete the contract. And they made it. They got the airmail delivered October 27th, 28th, I don't know the exact date. And they established FAM-1, Foreign Airmail Contract number 1. Pan Am flew the mail for the US Post Office from Key West to Havana, 90 miles. Within 2 years, Pan Am had stretched their routes all the way to Rio de Janeiro, all the way over to Santiago, Chile, over the mountains. And Tripp's ego was so great that he decided to hire the Michael Jordan, LeBron James, whatever name you want to put. He wanted to hire star quality, and he hired Lindbergh. The year after Lindbergh flew the Atlantic solo for $10,000 a year and stock options. Lindbergh wasn't dumb. He never had to work again. The stock options paid off so handsomely that he became independently wealthy on that one deal. And Tripp got Lindbergh to work for him because they shared the same dream of making aviation a part of everyday life. Make the planes so big that they couldn't crash, so safe that everybody would take their mother and their grandmother. And aviation changed forever because Tripp and Lindbergh came up with the specifications for flying to Europe. That's where the money was. Remember, Europe. That's where the business was. That's where the money was. So they put down the specifications. Had to be able to fly 3,000 miles, had to be able to carry a payload, had to be able to do this and this and this. And they sent the specifications out to every aviation company in America, maybe the world. They got 2 bids. They got a bid from the Sikorsky from Connecticut, and their bid was for the S-42. Now, the S-42, remember, they had to fly to Europe. It had a range of 1,200 miles. Well, you know, it's 3,000 miles to Europe. That's an awful long way without, oh, no problem. We'll just take rubber bladders, we'll put them in the plane, we'll load the plane with rubber bladders, and we'll put 1.5 times more fuel in the rubber bladders inside the plane than we have in the tanks. So it's really got 3,000 miles of range. But imagine riding in a plane full of rubber bladders full of gas that stunk to high heaven. But that's what Sikorsky offered, and for the princely sum of $240,000 each, it had a range of 1,200 miles, could carry 32 passengers and a crew of 5. But with the onboard fuel tanks, it could get you to Europe. Big deal. No people, just the crew, you know, they're not gonna make a lot of money. To put things in perspective, first of all, we're in the depth of the Depression. And secondly, the most expensive plane being built at that time was $50,000 for a DC-2. So here they were offering a Sikorsky S-42 for $240,000 compared to the $50,000 for a DC-2 they were flying domestically. That was the bid from Sikorsky. But along comes Martin, Glenn Martin, famous World War I aviator. And he's going to give them a real plane with real range. And that plane is the Martin 130. Now the Martin 130 cost $450,000. It had a range of 3,200 miles. It could carry 46 day passengers, 18 to 30 overnight, had a crew of 7. Well, to buy either one of those packages, either 3 of the Sikorskys or 3 of the Martins, would have been the most outlandish purchase for this little corporation of Pan Am. So you know what Jon Tripp did? He signed both contracts. He bought 3 Sikorskys, he bought 3 Martins, and in his classic way, he set them against each other. You think you're so good? Let's see what kind of plane you can build. Well, Tripp did that throughout his career. He was always setting up situations where people had to compete against other people. And in this case, they signed the contracts in 32. The S-42 was delivered in 34. And Tripp said, oh, good, well, now we'll get the Martins, we'll fly to Europe. One serious problem. The United States would not let any foreign power land in New York or in Honolulu. So guess what they said? You're not coming to Europe. Now, Tripp has just bought 6 airplanes that are going to bankrupt the company to fly to Europe. And what happened when they couldn't fly to Europe? Did Tripp cancel the contracts, try to get out of it? Hell no. He just said, we'll show them, we'll fly to Hong Kong. A lot of business in Hong Kong. A lot of Chinese in Hong Kong. We could fly there, make a lot of money. He forgot one thing. Hong Kong's British. So now Tripp's got 6 planes. He can't fly them to Europe. He can't fly them to Hong Kong. He says, we'll go to Manila. You know, there was nothing in Manila. Manila was the backwater of the world. They got carts drawn by water buffalo. But Tripp made it sound like it'd be the greatest destination in the world. We're going to fly to Manila. There was nothing there. And as Ed pointed out to you, in order to get to Manila, you had to fly across this ocean. We all knew there was Honolulu there. Midway was a cable base where they brought the Trans-Pacific cable in, so at least we had an island there that we controlled. And as Ed properly pointed out, there was nothing between Midway and Guam, and it was too far to fly, and Tripp literally went to the library and found Wake Island. The United States immediately claimed it as their possession, much to the chagrin of the Japanese, who had used it for years for for fishermen when they were in trouble, they could stay over. And that's why they called Pan Am the chosen instrument. They needed it, the government did it. So in order to get to Manila, they go to Honolulu the first night, stay at the Royal Hawaiian, wasn't bad. They go to Midway, they go to Wake, they go to Guam, and then the last flight they go to Manila. So, to build the bases, they chartered this Alaskan freighter, the North Haven, and here it is at Pier 22 in San Francisco, loaded with 100 construction workers, all the equipment, all the thing to build these bases in, they had to build whole cities or towns in Midway and Wake, and they had to do a lot of improvements in Midway and Guam and in Manila. So they departed in March of 1935, and they went to Honolulu, and they set up these directional finders so that the pilots could find the island. And as soon as they did that, they went on to Midway. And as soon as they left Honolulu in April, they made arrangements for the first flight to Honolulu in April. Then they go to Midway. When they get that base done in June, they go on to Wake. And here's what these little bases look like. On the ship were the station managers for the Pacific bases. And on the far left is a guy named Gregory. I didn't have much feeling for him. He's kind of a quiet guy. Bricknell was a retired Navy officer, big personality. Lauder was kind of a store clerk type, nice guy. And here on the end is Myron Ken Kendler. Became my friend. Found him in Fort Lauderdale. Delightful, delightful man. He went out. He'd gone to Johns Hopkins Medical School, and he was going to get the princely sum of $100 a month to be the doctor on Wake Island and the doctor on the expedition going out. And we remained friends from the time I met him in '96 until he passed away. And he told me a lot of good stories and gave me a lot of pictures. So here's the base being built at Midway. And these are the directional finders. This was the invention of Pan Am, and it allowed them to get these pilots to these little islands. They'd line them up as long as they could, and then as the pilot came in, if he stayed on one side of the line, he'd get one signal, the other side he'd get the other, but if he was right on target, he'd find this little speck using these radio directional finders. So this is another view of downtown Midway. They had outdoor movie theater, a lot of crabs. Wake, pretty much the same. This is what healthcare looked like. This was universal healthcare in Wake Island, 1935. Nothing for nobody. I didn't want to leave that. Dr. Kindler would do his examinations here. The radio tower was there. If it was something intimate, they'd pull the curtain. If it wasn't, you were just there. So, and he told me a lot about the life, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. In fact, I'll get to him later. So here's my next friend, Harry Candidate. When I first started collecting, I said these pilots had retired to South Florida. So I called Harry Candidate up and I said, Harry, I'm starting to get interested in this Pan Am history, and it seems like you played a really interesting part in it in the beginning. Could I come down and talk to you? For some reason, he wasn't afraid of trial lawyers. He said, come on down. And I went down, and he was an old guy, probably 5 years younger than I am now. And we went through all these wonderful letters that he had saved. He was a junior. He was only 23 years old, just been married. And he had all these wonderful letters. I get done and I said, gosh, I've just started to collect this stuff. Could I buy a couple of these from you? He said, hell no. He said, I'm going to give them to you. Nobody in my family cares a hoot about them. And I said, Harry, I promise you, one day I'll write a book, and your role with Pan Am will play an important part in that book. And we stayed in touch until he passed away. And his granddaughter wrote to me after he died. And, after they had the service at the church, they went back, they got out my book, and they read the sections that I had written about Harry Candidate. And it was just a wonderful feeling that I'd kept my promise, and it meant so much to the family when he passed away that his remarkable role with Pan Am was not forgotten. So he's our guide. He did all 4 of the survey flights, and we would talk every couple of months, and I just loved the guy. So here's the first survey flight in April of '35. Remember, the construction boat went out. They put these directional finders over on Diamond Head, right underneath Diamond Head, and when they were ready, they brought it out. Now this is a very special picture. You can see how open Diamond Head was. It's signed by the entire crew, and this is what I like, about the things I collect. They've got the human hand. They could probably get DNA off of that at this point. But music was such a stickler. When they completed this 18-hour flight, and the guys have been sitting in this plane full of gasoline. Remember that, this thing was loaded with gasoline. And he made them shave and put on a fresh shirt. He circled, he wouldn't land until they were ready. And then when they landed, they'd come off looking like it was just, walking the park, oh, nothing unusual. And here they've, been flying for 18 hours. On the return flight, they hit headwinds and literally landed with only fuels in the tank. So it could have been an absolute disaster. But to the world, it was just a cakewalk. It was nothing. Here they are at Ford Island. Look at those stylish swimsuits bringing in the plane. Okay. Always a good crowd. And I love this one. Here is Clarence Young, right back here. He was 47 years old, chain smoking, cursing, and he married a 23-year-old starlet named Moran, Lois Moran, who was in Of Thee I Sing on Broadway. And guess what? He wrote the whole thing off to Pan Am. They came over on the Laura line. They stayed at the Royal Hawaiian. They had their honeymoon at the expense of Pan Am while he's waiting for the plane to come. And here he is now, newly married, greeting. Captain Music is next to him, the famous Music, Lindbergh, and Amelia Earhart were the most famous aviators in the world. And this man in front was the main mechanic. In Miami, they moved him out here, and his daughter and I are still friends. A guy named Phil Burst, and he was in on all the flights. So I connected with these people on several different levels. And here they are taking the pose of the 4 Horsemen of Notre Dame. You've got my buddy Harry Candidate here on the end, the young, fresh-faced kid. You got Music, the recognized, where's my red dot? I don't even see it there. Music's in the middle. And Noonan was the drunk who was the navigator for Amelia Earhart when she disappeared. He lasted about 8 or 10 flights with Pan Am, drank himself out of the job. It's unfortunate, he was a good navigator when he was sober. And then you have Clarence Young in the back, who was the commercial manager for Pan Am. And this is a flight cover. And this one's rather common. Anybody interested in it can probably pick one up on eBay for $25, $30. But it has such history in it. It has the 2 cachets, one for the flight from Honolulu, from the US to Honolulu, and another one from Honolulu back. And you could buy that $10, $15 without the signatures. With the signatures, things get a little pricier, but still not ridiculous. And I love it because it's real history. The people actually flew it, they signed it. It's a moment in history that these people bring alive. So for the flight from Honolulu to Midway, that's the first flight to Midway, they carved these cachets with the Goonie bird. The Goonie birds are all over at Midway, so they carved this in a wood block. And these were mainly for their family and friends. So the ones to Wake and Midway are quite special. The ones to Hawaii and Guam are more common. But here's Harry Candidate did this one for himself and addressed it to the family. They always loved to have a big meal on Midway Island and with ice cream. I mean, the idea that you could have ice cream in the middle of the Pacific, they just thought was cooler than cool. And wine. And so they'd take the menu and they'd stamp it, and they'd send it home to their family and say, I had ice cream on Midway Island. And that was always a big deal. Well, now we're getting ready to fly to Wake in August of 1935. And they're using the S-42 filled with these bladders full of gas because Martin hadn't delivered yet. And they couldn't deliver one. In order to start trans-Pacific service, they needed two in order to have their weekly service. So just getting one done didn't do it. So Ed Musick, the most famous pilot, is back in Baltimore learning how to fly the Martin 130. And Sullivan, here, guy looked like a movie star. All these guys look like movie stars. You know, now you see the pilots, you see the flight attendants, nobody looks like a movie star. But back then, they all looked like movie stars. And unfortunately, Sullivan, on a flight to Lisbon, dipped a wing and flipped the plane, and a bunch of people were killed. And one of it, I think his first officer saved the life of Gene Froman, a singer or something, and then they ended up getting married. It was a wonderful love story. Other people know more of that history than I do. But this is the survey flight to Wake Island, Musick back learning how to fly. And this is a wonderful letter that I'll share with you. I was doing my first book, and I took one of these envelopes that Harry Kennedy gave me, and gee, I think there's a letter inside. I open up the letter, and here's this love letter that Harry Kennedy wrote to his wife. 6 months ago today, to this very minute, we were married. They have been the happiest, most contented 6 months of my life. Oh, did I move off it? There's the letter. I love you with my whole heart. There will never be another but you, your adoring husband, Harry. So I called Harry. He was living up in Tallahassee. I said, Harry, I got this envelope that you gave me, and there's a lovely love letter in it. It's kind of personal. Do you mind if I put it in the book? He says, hell, I've been married 67 years. What difference is it going to make? So, Harry and I got along well. He spoke the talk. So now we're in Guam, and Musick is still back in Baltimore test flying the Martin 130. So Sullivan is here in the front. He loves standing in the front. He knew he was a good-looking guy. And my poor buddy Kennedy is hidden back here. You can hardly see. He's just got his hat there. I think Noonan was still hanging on. He hadn't drunk himself out of the position yet, but it wasn't long before he did. And here's the landing crew in Guam. You know, good-looking group, sharp. And here's a nice round trip Guam. As I said, the first flight to Honolulu with the two caches is fairly common. The first flight to Guam is fairly common. Now, in your packet of materials, I've given you a couple of these replicas of these first flight covers because they really told the story to me, and maybe they'll tell the story to you. And we'll touch on the ones that you have in your envelope. The first one was the first flight to Honolulu, and it's signed by the entire crew. Now we come to November 22nd, 1935. The China Clipper has been done since October, but they couldn't start the first flights until November when the Philippine Clipper got done. So here they are, 59 bags of mail, over 100,000 letters. The mail weighed 2,000 pounds. There wasn't room for Harry Kennedy. My buddy, our guide, had to be left on the dock because the plane was overloaded with flight mail. And it was overloaded for a couple of reasons. One, the successful trips had ignited the enthusiasm of America and of the world. And secondly, Roosevelt was a stamp collector. So you put those two things together, and this was bigger than sliced bread. Plus, it's the Depression. People didn't have a lot of money to spend on things. And they could get together the money for a couple of stamps to put on these things. And it just overloaded the plane if Harry Canaday was on it, so they left him off. Here they are getting ready to leave. And people talked in this really stilted talk. Here they are at their Alameda base getting ready, and here's Juan Tripp in a very conversational. China Clipper, are you ready? Captain Music replied. Pan American Airways, China Clipper standing by for orders, sir. Tripp stated, stand by, Captain Music, for station reports, which came in from Honolulu, Midway, Wake, Guam, and Manila. Tripp stated, stand by all stations, Postmaster General Farley. I have the honor to report, sir, that the Trans-Pacific Airmail is ready to inaugurate mail service of the United States Post Office from the mainland across the Pacific to the Philippines by way of Hawaii, Midway, Wake, and Guam. China Clipper prepared to depart. Now remember, this is 8 years after Lindbergh flew the Atlantic alone. It's 8 years after Pan Am was founded with a borrowed airplane, and it's in the depths of the Depression. They were told they couldn't fly to Europe. They were told they couldn't fly to Hong Kong. And here Tripp is celebrating a great accomplishment because he wouldn't give up. So the man had his weaknesses, but he sure had his strengths. He had a belief that aviation would change the world, and he was going to be the man to do it. So they took off. Boy, did they take off. Overloaded. Heading for the Oakland Bay Bridge under construction. Couldn't get enough altitude to clear it. Oh my God, there's cables hanging down. Can you see those cables? They're bare. They're total disaster. 6 or 8 planes following thought it was on purpose. So they followed through underneath the Oakland Bay Bridge. This could have been the shortest trans-Pacific flight in history. And I guess Tripp deserved some good luck at that point because they got through, and those wires are very, very hard to see. Even on this picture, you can see them here. They're all hanging down everywhere. Well, the next bridge is the Golden Gate under construction. Things were booming. They were buying their way out of the Depression, building bridges everywhere. We haven't fixed those bridges since then, you know. And that's just one of the towers coming up. And this is leaving San Francisco Harbor, San Francisco Bay. Here we are. We made it to Pearl City, Honolulu, paradise, after only a 20-hour flight. They pick them up in station wagons. They take them down to the Royal Hawaiian. They give them a good night's sleep, and they get them up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get on the flight to Midway. But here's the crew. And, I mean, I got one lay. Look how many lays those guys got. Darlene, did you have anything to do with any of that? This I love. I have, just for you people, been able to secure VIP seats at the arrival of the China Clipper. And here's what your card says. It's all in your envelope. I'm only kidding, it's not there. You're cordially invited to be present to welcome the China Clipper on its first landing in Hawaii, inaugurating Trans-Pacific Airmail service of Pan American Airways on Saturday, November 23rd, 9:35 at 8:30 a.m. at the new operating base, Pearl City Peninsula, midway between the yacht club and the ferry landing. Plane due to arrive at 9 a.m. Present this card to reserve section. So you're all very fortunate to be in the VIP section. Here is the moment of touchdown in Manila. And it was 59 hours of flight, 5 days versus 3 weeks by ship. I love this picture. This is the welcome. That means welcome in Spanish or Filipino. And when I spoke in San Francisco on this about 8 years ago, not a young woman kind of my age, I guess. Kind of a good-looking woman, my age. she came up and she says, "That's my sister and I right there in the picture." And I got the biggest kick out of that, and she gave me a set of postcards that her uncle had sent her on the trip. But that's the kind of fun I've had with this hobby. Those two little girls, one of them showed up at my talk. When I spoke in San Francisco to a group probably 10, 12 years ago, I said, how many of you either flew on the Clipper or were working for Pan Am when they were flying the flying boats? 23 people stood up and told me the jobs they had. One of them was Ken Beer, 100 years old. He was the first flight, he was the captain on the first passenger flight to New Zealand. He signed an envelope for me called a flight cover. 60 years after he flew it, and his handwriting was as steady as a schoolboy's. He was national tennis champ from the time he was 80 until he was 100. He said it gets easier and easier. All I got to do is hit the ball over the net and I win the point. And he was there with his 78-year-old son. And I just love the guy, Ken Beer. I mean, they just were wonderful, wonderful people. Now here's the banquet held at the palace in Manila. And in the back you can see they got the crew and they got the word China Clipper. Now, I've handled this picture dozens of times. I have it in the slideshow. On the flight out, sitting next to Dr. Randall Sokomoto, I said, "Hey, Randy," he's my buddy now, you know, we've been traveling together. I said, "Ed Music signed this picture. I got to go back and look at my collection. I never knew that my collection had this picture signed by Ed Music, who was also at the luncheon." So that's how you find little things that make it interesting. Here's a great letter written by one of the crew members to his family. And all it basically said was, they've given us a wonderful welcome. He got the flight crew to sign the envelope. He got the flight crew to sign the letter. And imagine how proud a son would be to, here's what he said. "Dear Mom and Dad, just a note in a first flight cover to say that we had a splendid trip and reception banquet and all that on the way out. They mobbed us here and we just had lunch with the president, and I have to go to a big banquet at the palace tonight. All my love, Chan." And I forget he was the first engineer on the flight. Now here's a couple of really special items in my collection. On the left is the hub of one of the propellers of the China Clipper, engraved to Tim Young, the 3-year-old son of the commercial manager, with the original lampshade. It's one of these acetone things. And I have a little museum my son designed in my home. And that's the propeller hub. This is the propeller tip that was given to Clarence Young in 1943. And what's remarkable about this, it's got the name of everybody who was important in the first flight. Ed Music, Kennedy, people that had been dead 6 years signed this for him. I mean, Music had gone in 1938, but they got him to sign this in 1943. I guess I said that too fast. I don't know. Two other really special items. This is the ribbon that the crew would wear and the staff would wear in Manila when they had the celebration. And I said I knew the daughter of the mechanic. I'm sure it's the only one surviving. And after they did 2 flights, the China Clipper made its first flight and the Philippine Clipper made a successful flight. They pulled them out of service for about 6, 8 weeks. They sent the engines back, 16-cylinder engines. They had to rework all the piston heads to get more horsepower. And they took the old piston heads and made them into souvenirs. And this one was to One Trip by Pratt & Whitney. And I get this call before eBay. He says, "Mr. Krupnick," a very heavy German. He says, "I got something I think you want." I said, "What is it that I want?" He says, "I was the butler for the trips, and I have the gift here," and he had, I'll show you some other things. He had some things I wanted, so I got the, I got all of them, but now this is a sweet story. Remember Dr. Kindler was on the North Haven. He was the doctor for Wake Island, had that wonderful examining office below the lookout tower. I met him in Fort Lauderdale. I went to a stamp show, and a guy sold me a card that was signed by the doctor on Wake Island. And I bought it for $5, and I'm walking away from the table, and on the back of the card was an ad for a stamp show like 3 months before. And I said, wait a minute, this isn't old. He said, I never said it was old. I only said it was signed by the doctor from Wake Island. So I called the doctor. I said, doctor, I just paid $5 for your signature on a worthless card. And he says, I'd like to come out and meet you. Well, I went out and met him, and we became good friends. And I had him over for dinner, and he had all these wonderful envelopes, and I said, Ken, is there any way I could acquire these for my collection? You know, I'll give money to your charity, whatever you want. And he said, oh, John, I've had them for 60 cents. And his wife says, Myron, this man's going to get them sooner or later, so why don't you have the pleasure of giving them to him now while you're still with us, you know? So with that gentle nudge from his delightful wife, they all ended up in my collection. What makes this so exciting is, on the return flight of the China Clipper, Ken Kendler became the first passenger to ever fly on the China Clipper. And he wrote this letter to his mother. And it's just classic because it captures it captures the excitement of the moment by someone who lived it. And this is what's inside this letter. December 5th, 1935. Now he's flying back to the United States. He spent a year on Wake Island. He felt that his medical practice was stagnating. He had to get back and get working. Darlings, all of you, progress in speed has assumed regular scheduled transportation over these former vast expanses of water. Indeed, it was a privilege and a pleasure to return aboard the China Clipper on its maiden voyage. A word about the giant airliner. No doubt you have read considerably about it in the newspapers. The China Clipper is a flying miniature hotel weighing 61,000 pounds loaded. There is room for about 50 passengers. It accommodates 16 large-sized berths. When you'd be having dinner in the dining room, they'd be making your seat up into like a Pullman berth so you could sleep. There are arrangements for complete steward service. A lounge room is large, over 6 feet headroom. Comfortable seating in clubroom style. Very spacious, free to walk about. Noise of the motors diminished to a hum, so conversation is easily carried in a voice not much louder than normal talk. So the great history-making period is about over. Regards to all. Love, Ken. So he flew back, but one trip wasn't done. He had not gotten to Hong Kong. So he devised a VIP trip using, and this is another thing the butler gave me, the passport. You'll love this, ladies. In 1936, a woman didn't carry her own passport. She was added to her husband's passport because single women did not travel without their husbands. So she was on that. But one trip devised a VIP trip, not to fly to Hong Kong, but to fly to Macau. I mean, you think Manila's nothing, Macau's less. But here they are landing in Macau, telling Hong Kong we're going to move our base to Macau. Well, the Chinese merchants went nuts. They said, to heck with this being British. You're welcome in Hong Kong. So Tripp did the same thing. He played Macau off of Hong Kong. Hong Kong took the bait, opened the doors. They said, the heck with England. They're going to let Pan Am fly to Hong Kong. So Tripp got what he wanted. He got his direct connection to Hong Kong. Even though he couldn't go to Europe, he had a viable run. That's the North Pacific. Take a breath. We're going to go to the South Pacific. And I call this fools rush in where angels fear to tread. This had to be the dumbest thing that Juan Tripp ever did. Because they couldn't use English bases, the only places they could land going to New Zealand, first of all, Australia wouldn't let them in. Australia was more British than the British. New Zealand was like desperate. They were so isolated in the world, they said, we don't care what the Queen Mother says, we want a plane to come to New Zealand. So they allowed Pan Am to come, but they had to start the flights by the end of 1937. So the first stop was going to be Honolulu. Then they were going to use Kingman Reef. Kingman Reef is a reef in the middle of the Pacific. At low tide, the land area is slightly bigger than this auditorium. Seriously. That's all it was. Then they were going to go to Pago Pago, Pongo Pongo, depending how you pronounce it, American Samoa. Has a beautiful harbor completely surrounded by 2,000-foot hills. In order to land, you must come in at the end of the flight, at least you're empty, you don't have to come in hot. You come in, you land, you got to stop immediately or you go up on the reef. Very dangerous, but at least it was American. Then you could fly on to Auckland in New Zealand. Again, they outfitted, instead of being the North Haven, this was the North Wind, and they left March 10th, 1937, with 5 men to be at Kingman Reef to serve as the station ship. His son, Dan Vucic's son, gave me this log. This was a previously unknown historical document recounting the first flight to New Zealand. And this guy was called the supercargo, and the supercargo is the guy that is responsible for loading the ship, running the ship. He's not the captain of the ship, but he controls everything else. And it was his log that he kept along with the doctor. Here is Kingman Reef. This was the second stop on the flight to New Zealand. It was a joke. The idea that you could have regular service through Kingman Reef is ludicrous. I mean, this is what it looked like. That's Dr. French. Now here's one, we colorized it, you know, just to show you, but those are the 5 guys, and there's a photographer. That was the whole station. Now they left March 10th. Now, here's Pago Pago. You got to come in over these cliffs, drop to the water, then you got to stop it. It was going out before it gets to the reef. Then you turn around, you come back, and you go to the dock. This was stop number 2. And they put together the best crew, Captain Music, Canaday, and the purser, who's become important later on. I'll tell you why he becomes important. But this was the top-notch crew to fly this ridiculous route. And the reason Tripp wanted to do it is because the British were coming the other way around on Imperial British Airways. And he did not want the British to get to New Zealand first. He wanted to be there first. So again, this is the S-42. This is the one with the 1.5 times more fuel inside the plane than in the fuel tanks. They got rubber bladders. They're landing in this ridiculous Kingman Reef. And here's the flight from hell. This is the flight that was too much for music. And I'll show you some of the, okay. They landed in a torrential downpour. They had to get out into boats and go to this ship that is rocking. And here's what that log, you remember that log I showed you when I jumped ahead one? That log I showed you. Here's what the doctor wrote. It's noon. We realized the plane would arrive in a short time. At this time, they're having rain squalls. Very, very hard. Visibility was bad, almost zero. However, she kept coming through. What else could she do? She didn't have enough fuel to go back. They're trying to find this little speck, and they're saying she kept coming through. Desperate, looking for the island. The place is reeking of fuel. They fly over low. They couldn't see it. Then they circled around for 45 minutes. They finally found it, and they landed in a very heavy storm, much drenched. Delightful. And here's what Vucic wrote in his. The accommodations on this freighter are poor. We did our very best to satisfy the flight crew, the boys who deserve the best, sturdy navigators of the air and plucky pioneers. I surrendered my humble little cabin to Captain Music. I had 2 lays in my cabin. I remember, he got the lays March 10th. This is March 24th. They've been sitting in a hot cabin for 2 weeks. He comes in a driving rain. His raincoat is leaking, and they put 2 lays around his neck that are 2 weeks old. I mean, can you think of a more miserable? I mean, don't they look miserable? Absolutely ridiculous. Now here they are coming into Pago Pago, which wasn't much better. You have to drop like a rock. You taxi up. Anyone ever read Somerset Maugham's Rain? It's a novel. This is the Sadie Thompson boarding house that plays a prominent role in the movie Rain. And this is where the Pan Am crew stayed. Here they are coming ashore in New Zealand after this perilous flight, just miserable flight. Captain Music leading the way. My buddy Harry Canaday down here, he was 23. Gaddy was a very famous navigator. He went around the world with Wally Post. Wally Post, of course, was the aviator that was flying with Will Rogers when he died. But Gaddy was from Tasmania and they thought that he would get them into Australia. He was trying to do the same thing with New Zealand that he did with Manila and Hong Kong. He was trying to use New Zealand to get to Australia. And here they are at Mechanics Bay in Australia, and they were so excited to see him. Wait a minute, look at this. Look at Ed Music's eye. He looks exhausted. He's thinking, what in the hell am I risking my life in this plane, trying to come down here just to beat the British, and I got to do it again 4 days after I get back in order to get service going. He looked disgusted. Now, here's that envelope that got me started collecting because it was the only one known. 2 others have been found. They're both in my collection. So there were 3 letters to Kingman Reef. That's in your envelope, this particular one. This one I love because the purser, I showed you the purser on the crew on the far left, a guy named Ivan Parker. He did this one to President Roosevelt. It's the only one known that was on the flight to New Zealand that was postmarked in American Samoa. So it's a unique item. In my mind, it's priceless for its historical content. Had what they called a cachet that is not seen anywhere else. Just a great item. And this is the most desirable of these flight covers in existence. Gaddy trained in aviation in the United States, and a friend of his wrote a letter to him and addressed it to Clarence Young at their base in Alameda. And when Music was making the flight to New Zealand, he carried this letter from San Francisco to Honolulu, from Honolulu to Kingman Reef to American Samoa, and the only letter carried by Music on the first survey flight to New Zealand. It's just an absolute gem of history that I put in your envelope. The second time they went to Kingman Reef, that old freighter was gone. They had substituted the Fairwind, which was a sailboat. I don't think it was much of an improvement. And this is why they had the competition. On the second flight, the British have arrived, Christmas Day, 1937, and they have a friendly meeting, and I'm sure it was friendly, yeah, right. The competition, you could almost cut it with a knife at that point. The Music doesn't look too happy. You know, he looked a lot like Humphrey Bogart, didn't he? And, it was just killing him. It was just killing him. They had to go back 4 days later. On the next trip, when they took off from American Samoa, an oil leak developed in one of the engines. And I showed you that harbor was so tight that if you came in full of fuel, you'd come in too hot, too much power, you'd land and you'd go up on the reef and destroy the plane. So as Music is circling back to make an emergency landing at American Samoa, he has to jettison his jet fuel. In jettisoning the fuel, the dump valve was not quite long enough. They got creep, they got the vapors and the gas coming back up, and when they hit the engine, the plane exploded. And it was about 10 miles from Pago Pago, but he hadn't dumped enough fuel yet. He had to dump more fuel, and it was a tragedy. In the Polynesian Way, they made a huge memorial wreath. They took it to the site of where the plane crash occurred, and they put it in the water. The CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, which was our FAA, closed the route through Kingman Reef and American Samoa. Far too dangerous. They didn't attempt any more flights until they got the Boeing 314. The Boeing 314 came on in February of 1939. And it was a real airplane. But it's kind of fun to look at this. This was how they thought it was going to look. There's only one tail fin. Do you see that? Single fin. And they found out that that was not stable when they were taxing and winds. So they went to the double fin, okay? By the time they built the plane, which was a beautiful plane, the triple tail fins had become standard. The new route, now as World War II is coming, all these old things about you can't land in my place, I can't land in yours, were being forgotten. Europe needed help. The British gave us Canton Island to use as a mid-Pacific base. The French said, come on down, New Caledonia, we'll make you feel welcome. You're going to hear a wonderful talk about New Caledonia later. And with the Boeing 314, it was good. Now, this is Canton Island, beautiful lagoon. They built the hotel up in this area. And they did the same thing as they'd done before. They built the villages. This is a lighthouse they built to the memory of Ed Music on Canton Island. It's still there. In my book, I sent a roll of film to Canton Island, and I asked the next yachty going through to take some pictures and send it back to me. And they're in the book from 1997 about, and I think it's still there. Jimmy Buffett and I talked about going down and getting this plaque and bringing it back and putting it in the museum in San Francisco. One trouble, the country of Kitty Boss didn't think it was such a good idea. So we didn't want to get in trouble taking that. This is New Caledonia. The base was out here on this island, and this was a French provincial town. Didn't have a first-class boarding house. So, you know, what Jon Krupnick did, I'll show you. Here's the base before they fixed it up. Here it is after they fixed it up in New Caledonia. This is Canton Island again, back on Canton. This is New Caledonia. You can see the base that they had fixed up. That was their headquarters. And there's the plane on one of their survey flights before they started passenger service. Jon Krupnick bought the yacht Ladonia, which was owned by Cyrus Curtis, who was the publisher of Saturday Evening Post. And they built small cabins on the top for the crew, and the passengers had the run of the luxurious cabins. And if they had 4 passengers, you know, that would be a lot. And here they are making the first flight in the Boeing 314, 11-man crew. Think about what you have now, how big the crews are. This is the VIP flight. Some of the people you recognize, Clarence Young was there. He was still the commercial manager. He was for 25 years. Gaddy, the Tasmanian, who never did get them to Australia. Australia never buckled, never buckled. Here they are in Mechanics Bay, a rare color picture. This is the extension of routes to Singapore, May of 1941. The war is getting close. One letter said, you people don't know how bad it is, but we're involved in a real war out here. That was the Captain Burroughs on the first flight to Singapore, which was highly successful. They only added one more first flight before World War II, and that was a stop at Fiji. And they went to Fiji so that they could refuel and carry more freight. With the oncoming war, a lot more freight was being carried between these different countries, and it wasn't that they had hoped to maybe get 10 passengers from Fiji a year, and I think they got 10 the first flight, so they were surprised there was any service. Getting a little tired of doing these first flights. This is in my collection. It's the only known Fiji first flight that had the whole crew signing it. There's a lot of them that just had the captain, but by now they're saying, come on, that's old stuff, man. We're not doing that anymore. So they didn't do the first flight. Here's what it looked like at the outbreak of World War II. They were coming to Honolulu from both San Francisco and LA. Then the northern route would go to Midway, Wake, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore. The southern route would go through Canton Island, Fiji, New Caledonia, and Auckland. Now we're going to go to the last flight, April of 1946. I told you it was a short period. April 35 was the first survey flight. April 46 is the last flight. Now, if any of you people go to flea markets, I'm going to tell you something you can look for, because there ought to be a lot of them, and I have found one after looking for 40 years, and maybe they're out here in Hawaii. I don't know where they are, but the public relations director for Pan Am, a guy named Bill Van Dusen, would write what he called Dear Senior letters to all the editors in America, 2,500 newspaper editors, and he'd keep them up to date on what was going on with Pan Am. And I've got 15 or 20 of these Dear Senior letters. But on this last flight, and here that's the mechanic and that's the captain, I could never find what I call the bookend, the last flight. And I finally talked a collector out of one, but I tell all of you to look for it because maybe you'll find it someday. All right, here's the picture that's in my book here. Without it, the only person I knew was the captain on the far left, Terrell, Dent Terrell. And this was the crew. So when I spoke in San Francisco at the 75th anniversary, somebody came up, and I'm going to do a book again called Final Flight. I'll show you the cover of it. And they said, you know, the flight engineer, the flight engineer from the final flight is in your audience tonight, Tom Keewan. And I said, oh, really? I said, yeah. So I said, let me meet him. So I go down and say, hey, Tom, I'm Jon Krupnick. He says, oh, I know who you are. I got your book. And I said, oh, Tom. I said, I want to do another book. I want to call it Final Flight. And I want to tell a lot about this final flight. Do you happen to remember any of your crew members? He says, yeah, one of them was Jon Krupnick. And I'm thinking, oh, my God. He's old. He's confused. I'm Jon Krupnick. He's Tom Keewan. I said, Tom, I'm Jon Krupnick. Do you remember the name of any of your flight crew? He said, yeah, one of them was Krupnick. I flew the Pacific with him half a dozen times. I said, you're kidding me. So he said, no, I'll send you a picture, the official picture of this flight, because I was on it. Tom Keewan is right there. He's a tall, good-looking guy. Unfortunately, this man just died December of Christmas this year, so Keewan's the last surviving member. All right, here's that letter I'm telling you about. This is what the envelope will look like. You go to a flea market, you find an envelope. It's going to be a Pan Am envelope. Legal, it's going to say news, and it's going to have a 5-page letter. And I'll read you the best part of that letter. I love this letter. And this will pretty much close my talk, but I've got to read this because I think it's so wonderful. Very ordinary looking envelope. Public relations man Van Dusen wrote it. And here's what he wrote. We couldn't let these grand old ladies pass out of the picture without a little visit. We're going to miss them. Why, they had more sex and glamour in 5 minutes than we can build into a land plane in 5 years. From the flying man's side, we're losing something too. These boats made America first on the airways of the world. We can't very well, and we shouldn't forget. They contributed a chapter in the annals of flying that'll still be thrilling reading for generations to come. And this proves that what they did is not forgotten. They bred a new breed of airmen who talked and thought and worked in the logo of the sea air. They left an indelible mark, and they'll take with them some of the glory, some of the sense of accomplishment, some of the excitement of the first, some of the thrill of man against the sea, some of that bold adventure of explorer and pioneer. Yes, some of the faith and the hope and the courage of all those who fly. So hail, old timers, hail and farewell, William Van Dusen. And when this plane landed, after a 16-hour flight from Honolulu, the Connie was standing by and completed the flight in 9 hours and 9 minutes. So they went from 16 hours in the flying boat to 9 hours with the land plane. But you're not done. I got a homework assignment for you. Pay attention. This is going to be my next book, if I have enough fuel in the tank to do it, Final Flight. I have actually paid a royalty. First time I paid a royalty to use pictures, I just use them and hope I don't get sued. This one I actually paid for because I knew Saturday Evening Post would sue me. That's a cover off the Saturday Evening Post, exactly as it is. We have put in the language, Pacific Pioneers in Final Flight. But it's a wonderful picture of the China Clipper flying out of the wing of an eagle, 1938 cover, and that's in my collection. That's going to be the cover of the next book. And Final Flight's going to be in it. Here we colorized the picture with all the names. This is what Tom Keewan gave me. Here's Jon Krupnick, right on the end. He looks exactly like my cousin. I'm sorry to say most of them look like movie stars. My cousin looked like my cousin. And his son, who I'm good friends with, who's also named Jon Krupnick, thinks that looks exactly like his dad. His dad's name was Jim. But the census, after 72 years, they release all the confidential information. So conceivably, somebody out there who's good on research can find out in the 1940 census who this Jon Krupnick was who flew for Pan Am. And if any of you do, I've given you my contact information 18 different ways, all those little cards and everything, hoping if you have something interesting to sell or something, whatever. But if you can figure out who this guy is, because Krupnick's a name, like a lot of names, it came from Ellis Island. We don't know, where it came from. And my dad was Jewish, my mother was Catholic, I'm whatever, I'm Irish, I'm everything. So knowing the real history doesn't matter. Somehow, some way, he picked up the name Krupnick, and he was the radio engineer on 6 flights. There's Jon Krupnick. Somebody find him for me. This is a copy of the print that I gave to everybody at the 75th anniversary. The original is in my collection. I am not a member of the Pan Am family, but by adoption, you have now got me for better or for worse. I love talking to you guys. It's been a real pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed a flight back in time. Thanks a lot.
John, hang in here for a couple minutes. That was a wonderful, that was just an absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.